Korea, a crowded little finger of land, but of key importance to the free world in the Far East. What happened here opened the next major chapter in the history of the United States Army. The war began here, at the 38th parallel. Just how did this imaginary line become the fuse for a 3-year explosion? Before the Japanese surrender in World War II, we made an agreement with the Russians, who were then our allies. When surrender came on the Asian mainland, Russian troops would accept the surrender of Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel, and we would do the same south of it. The 38th parallel was chosen because it divides the Korean peninsula roughly in half. It was also agreed that free elections would be held, and the government of Korea returned to the Korean people. In August of 1948, free elections were held in South Korea, supervised by United Nations inspectors, establishing the Republic of Korea. 3 weeks later, communist-controlled elections in North Korea, from which UN inspectors were barred, established the communist regime and divided the Korean nation. Not long afterwards, the communists decided their moment for conquest had come.
In early summer 1950, life was good in the agricultural South. There was peace, time for living in the quiet, ancient way. Then suddenly, in the pre-dawn darkness of June 25th, 1950, South Koreans were jarred awake by a living nightmare. Unprovoked and unannounced, the communists' latest war of conquest had begun. Many thought it was the beginning of World War III. It might have been if we had not taken immediate action. President Truman ordered our Navy and Air Force to provide cover and support to the Republic of Korea. In the United Nations, United States Delegate Warren Austin spoke for the indignant people of free nations everywhere.
The armed invasion of the Republic of Korea continues. The Republic of Korea has appealed to the United Nations for protection. I am proud to report that the United States is prepared to furnish assistance to the Republic of Korea.
While back and forth along the twisted length of the main line of resistance raged the bitter hill battles. In March 1953, the communist world was shaken by the death of Joseph Stalin. His successor, Georgy Malenkov, launched what he termed a worldwide peace offensive. Its influence would soon be felt in Korea. Within a month, the communists suddenly took us up on our standing offer to exchange sick and wounded prisoners. This was Operation Little Switch. It indicated that a ceasefire might come soon. Battle-weary men listened for word that the shooting was to end. On July 27, 1953, at the UN base camp in Moonsani, General Mark Clark signed the ceasefire agreement. A few miles away, the communists did the same. By August 5th, Operation Big Switch was underway. Some 13,000 UN soldiers returned from Red prison camps. General William Dean, captured in the battle for Tejon early in the war, returned with his thousands of comrades in arms. It was then that the world image of communism received a telling blow. For 2/3 of the Chinese prisoners refused to return to Red China, and 35,000 North Koreans decided they'd rather live in South Korea. An armistice, however, is only a ceasefire, not peace. And in this divided nation, the need is for constant watchfulness. Unending preparedness still remains and may continue for years to come. This is true anywhere on earth where people face an aggressor.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko told me in my office that he was instructed to make it clear once again, as he said his government had already done, that Soviet assistance to Cuba, and I quote, pursued solely the purpose of contributing to the defense capabilities of Cuba, unquote. That, and I quote him, training by Soviet specialists of Cuban nationals in handling defensive armaments was by no means offensive. And that if it were otherwise, Mr. Gromyko went on, the Soviet government would never become involved in rendering such assistance, unquote. That statement also was false. Acting therefore in the defense of our own security and of the entire Western Hemisphere, and under the authority entrusted to me by the Constitution, as endorsed by the resolution of the Congress, I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations. I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort to end the perilous arms race and to transform the history of man. Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom. here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved.
Nikita Khrushchev, now retired, has time to relax and enjoy nature. But when he ruled the Soviet Union, it was a superpower, and his actions affected the world. Now his world is one small garden. Not long before he died, he reflects on his motives and behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Kennedy and I are different people. I used to be a miner, a working man. He's a millionaire, the son of a millionaire. We represent classes that cannot be reconciled. His aim was to strengthen capitalism. Mine was to destroy capitalism.
The planet Earth, 4 billion years of life. And for the first time, mankind has the ability to destroy it all in one blow. In 1962, the world is divided between East and West. A balance of terror exists in the competition over atomic superiority. A Cold War so far. A U-2 reconnaissance plane is on a special mission authorized by President Kennedy. In the cockpit, Richard Heiser.
I knew it was an important mission because I had 2 generals, Air Force generals out there to brief me on the missions.
The target, Cuba.
They were pretty well convinced of what was going on, a lot of the people in the intelligence community. But to be able to prove to the people who were not intelligence people, it took a picture. Show me a picture.
A suspicion based on reports that Soviet nuclear weapons might be based on Cuba, with missiles aimed at the United States. Major Heiser is a photographic reconnaissance specialist. With this Ka-18 strip camera, he can take thousands of photos in a couple of minutes from 12 miles overhead. It's a risky undertaking for the pilot.
I was briefed that there was a possibility or a probability that I'd be fired at. The mission was designed to fly as high as I could fly, maximum altitude. And I think any U-2 pilot will tell you that from the time they push the throttle forward on takeoff, the adrenaline shoots. The adrenaline shoots until you land.
For some, it was hard to believe the Soviets would take such a risk.
The Soviets had never placed their own nuclear missiles outside their own borders. They were highly secret weapons that they feared might fall into the hands of the United States and the West. They were highly dangerous weapons, and they did not want those weapons to come under the control of anyone else.
The photo analysts work overtime. There's 3 miles of film, thousands of photographs to be developed and evaluated. They're searching for a needle in a haystack, looking for tiny clues visible only with a microscope.
One of the scanners noted that there was changes in the San Cristobal area. So he hands the film over to a missile team, and they knew about what the missile sites looked like in the Soviet Union.
The sites in Cuba match perfectly.
When I scribed the circle from San Cristobal, and it included Washington, I knew that Washington, therefore, was going to be a target, certainly. No doubt about it. I knew that this was going to be not only historic, but possibly a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union.
These pictures will change the world. Nuclear weapons are at the doorstep of the United States. The President of the United States still doesn't know about the photographs. John F. Kennedy is holding a reception for a state visitor, Algeria's Ahmed Ben Bella. The youngest elected president, John F. Kennedy represents a new hope. He wants to lead his country in a new direction, advocating a more vigorous government. Along with his wife, Jackie, he represents a new generation in America. Jack Kennedy knows how to portray himself. He understands the powerful effect of images. And how to win people over. This evening, all is still quiet at the White House.
Now, it just so happened this was election period, and the president was upper New York state campaigning, and he wasn't going to get home until later that night. George Bundy decided that let the president have a good night rest, and then we'll tell him.
It would be his last good night's rest for a while. On October 16th, the race against time begins. National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy shows President Kennedy the photographs, the evidence. Soviet missiles placed in Cuba can reach Washington in 10 minutes. They represent the gravest threat the U.S. has ever faced.
Total shock. Why in God's name would the Soviets do such a thing? They must have thought we would react. At least that was our feeling. Why did they do it? Total shock.
The Kremlin. For centuries, it has been the symbol of power in Russia, where czars have lived and where Soviet leaders have ruled. On some occasions, the public is let in to meet their leader, like this reception for workers and farmers from the Ukraine. Nikita Khrushchev has total control over the Soviet Union. He's determined that his country will flourish once again, that communism will ultimately triumph over capitalism.
You know, the whole crisis was really due to the fact that the USA did not want to recognize the Soviet Union as an equal player.
Khrushchev believes that putting missiles in Cuba will even the playing field.
He replied, "What's so special about that? You Americans have surrounded our entire country with missiles. You have missiles in Turkey, in Italy, and England. Why can't we do the same thing?"
45 American nuclear Jupiter missiles positioned in Turkey and Italy are close to the Soviet sphere of influence. Khrushchev saw the American superiority in strategic nuclear weapons. The Americans, together with the French and English, had 5,000 of them. And we had 300 nuclear warheads. The Soviet response is the SS-4 intermediate-range missile. It's part of the plan to achieve parity with American missile capacity. 36 of the SS-4s will make Cuba an impregnable fortress, a deterrent to any U.S. invasion. "36 missiles with nuclear warheads, each missile as powerful and deadly as 66 of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima. But placing nuclear missiles on Cuba is not only a political challenge, it is a threat to America's very existence. In the Oval Office, everyone agrees the missiles have to be removed. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and attorney general, advocates a vigorous response. But when?
We had a time advantage as long as the Soviets did not know that we knew. We used that time to formulate carefully our response. Until we were ready with the response, we did not want the Soviets to know that a response would be forthcoming.
And what will the response be? Is any response possible that doesn't rely on arms and lead to war? Is a peaceful response possible in the midst of the Cold War? A response that doesn't involve America backing down or appearing weak? A response worthy of a great power? A response that preserves life and the planet? Because nuclear war would mean the end of everything.
The Vietnam War was a devastating experience for the United States. More than 58,000 Americans were killed in the conflict, and the long, bitter war deeply divided the American people. Why did the country enter this costly war in the first place? Although the United States did not enter the war on a large scale until 1965, the build-up to war began many years earlier. In fact, American involvement in Vietnam dates back to World War II, when the United States sought to end the Japanese occupation of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. To do so, the U.S. government gave aid to a band of Vietnamese guerrilla fighters known as the Viet Minh. The group was led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist who greatly admired the United States. With American aid, the Viet Minh won control of large areas in northern Vietnam. When Japan surrendered to end World War II, it pulled its troops out of Vietnam. Ho and his followers saw the departure of the Japanese as an opportunity to drive out the French, who had ruled Vietnam for about 100 years as a colonial power. After the Japanese left the country, Ho declared Vietnam's independence. His declaration came in the midst of changing world politics, changes that would have profound effects on Vietnam. With the end of World War II, U.S. President Harry Truman worried about the growing power of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were installing communist governments in Eastern Europe, creating a strong communist bloc. Truman believed that communism threatened democracy and human rights, and saw it as the responsibility of the United States to prevent its spread. Truman viewed France, a democracy, as an ally in the struggle against communism. France, in turn, wanted to regain control of its colonies in Southeast Asia. That is why, when Ho Chi Minh asked the United States to help Vietnam, Truman never responded to his letters. Ho turned to fellow communists for support instead. Then, in 1949, Communist Mao Zedong took control of China. The change renewed American attention on Asia and increased American worries about communism in Vietnam. Back in Vietnam, France was busy fighting the Viet Minh to regain control of its former colony. Both China and the Soviet Union were supporting Ho's forces. To prevent Vietnam from falling into communist hands, the United States pledged economic and military support to the French. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became president. He and his advisors worried that if Vietnam turned communist, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow in turn. This idea, called the domino theory, would shape American actions in Vietnam for years to come. Then, in 1954, the French lost the vital battle of Dien Bien Phu. Weary of war, they prepared to withdraw from Vietnam. By international agreement, Vietnam was divided in half at the 17th parallel. Ho was allowed to control the northern half. Anti-communist forces held the southern half. The agreement also called for elections to be held so that Vietnam would be united under one leader. Ho was expected to win. But the United States had no desire for Vietnam to be unified under a communist leader. The elections never took place. The United States started providing economic and military aid to the South Vietnamese government, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was unpopular, however, and many in South Vietnam opposed his rule. Communists in the South formed a group known as the National Liberation Front. They sought to overthrow Diem and unite North and South Vietnam. NLF guerrilla fighters called the Viet Cong destroyed roads and bridges in the South and assassinated government officials. They carried out these attacks with the help of North Vietnam. After John F. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, U.S. involvement in Vietnam took a new turn. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had promised to back all wars of national liberation, like the one in Vietnam. This confirmed American fears that communists were bent on taking control of the world. Kennedy and his top aides saw South Vietnam as the only hope they had in preventing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Kennedy sent 400 military advisors to Vietnam to teach the South Vietnamese army how to fight the Viet Cong more effectively. North Vietnam grew concerned about increasing American involvement in the war. Meanwhile, support was dwindling for Diem and his government in South Vietnam. Diem showed favoritism to fellow Catholics, which angered the mostly Buddhist population of South Vietnam. Diem also cracked down on anyone opposed to his rule, whether communist or not. His government began arresting and even killing opponents. Buddhists began to burn themselves alive in protest of the Diem regime. American leaders came to think that they could never help South Vietnam win a war against communism under the leadership of Diem. To alleviate this problem, the United States backed a military coup to replace him. In November 1963, Diem was removed from power and assassinated. 3 weeks later, President Kennedy was assassinated. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was inaugurated as the new president. Johnson was a firm believer in the domino theory and did not want to be the president who let Southeast Asia fall to the communists. Johnson also thought that pulling out of Vietnam would destroy American credibility, since 2 prior presidents had pledged their devotion to a free South Vietnam. In January 1964, another coup took place, and General Nguyen Khanh became the new leader of South Vietnam. The United States began to support Khanh in hopes of obtaining a stable government in South Vietnam. Khanh was unable to build a strong base of support, however. The lack of a strong leader would make it very difficult for South Vietnam to defeat the communists. Then, in August 1964, the fighting took a new turn. An American destroyer, the USS Maddox, was patrolling the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam when North Vietnamese torpedo boats began to fire at it. 2 days later, the Maddox reported it was under attack again. The attacks infuriated President Johnson. He ordered airstrikes against North Vietnam in retaliation. He also asked Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted the president permission to do anything necessary to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The resolution allowed Johnson to send troops to fight in Vietnam without having to ask Congress for a declaration of war. Johnson began developing a strategy for complete American involvement in the war. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong were making more attacks on American positions. In February 1965, the Viet Cong initiated an attack on Pleiku, an airbase north of Saigon, killing 8 Americans and wounding many more. The political situation was worsening in South Vietnam too. Khan had been replaced, and a series of coups followed. Johnson's advisors urged him to mount a bombing campaign against North Vietnam to punish the North for its support of the Viet Cong and to rebuild morale in South Vietnam. Johnson agreed and ordered Operation Rolling Thunder, a continuous bombing campaign against North Vietnam. He hoped the intensive bombing would bring the North to peace talks. It did not work. While the bombing got underway, American military commanders warned that South Vietnam's army was on the verge of collapsing. Johnson sent more American troops into Vietnam. American soldiers also stepped out of their advisor roles to take on more active military operations. 3 weeks after a force of U.S. Marines was sent to protect the Air Force base in Da Nang, the Viet Cong attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. As attacks continued in the South, Johnson was forced to send more and more American troops. By the end of 1965, more than 180,000 troops were committed to Vietnam. The United States was now fully involved in the Vietnam War.